Socialism and Humanism by Lucien Goldmann. Lucien Goldmann is Director of Studies at the École Pratique des Hautes Études, I don't know, I'm pronouncing that wrong, 6th section in Paris, where he is in charge of teaching sociology of literature and philosophy, and also directs the Center of Studies of Literary Sociology at the Institute of Sociology at the University of Brussels. Born in Bucharest, Romania in 1913, Lucien Goldmann studied in Vienna under Max Adler, read law in Bucharest and Paris, and philosophy in Vienna, Zurich, and Paris, and subsequently worked with Jean Piaget in Geneva. His books include Human Community and the Universe According to Kant, Human Sciences and Philosophy, The Hidden God, Dialectical Research, and 3 studies on the sociology of the novel. In the minds of leading Marxist theorists before 1917, the triumph of the proletarian revolution, the socialization of the means of production, and the setting up of centralized planning would inevitably lead to a society organized in such a manner that after a preliminary phase of democratic dictatorship of the proletariat, the social body would then cease to be divided according to classes, and the exploitation of man by man would be abolished. This would subsequently lead to an integration of the major values inherited from middle-class humanism: universality, individual freedom, equality, the dignity of the human person, freedom of expression, so as to endow them, for the first time in the history of humanity, with a quality of authenticity, instead of the purely formal status that they had previously been granted in a capitalist society. True, democratic capitalist societies give legal recognition to the equality and freedom of all citizens before the law and the right of each individual to express his ideas freely. Economic inequality, however, reduces this equality and the individual's freedom to a purely formal status. Since the citizens of such a democracy are divided into a minority of the wealthy and a mass of relatively poor workers, and since this poverty deprives the mass of workers of the possibility of really enjoying the freedoms recognized by law and of using effectively the right of expressing their ideas publicly. A socialist society, on the other hand, was expected to re-establish real equality, and in its earliest stage, even to suppress all noticeable differences in wealth, so as to give freedom, equality, and human dignity their full meaning. In such a society, exploitation would be abolished. Production would be rationally planned, and the suppression of production for the market would reaffirm the qualitative nature of the relationship between human beings and goods, or other human beings, all of which would make it possible for this society to achieve a synthesis at a higher level of the positive elements of the 3 great forms of society which had preceded it. A. The classlessness of primitive societies. B. The qualitative relationships of men with other men and with nature which had characterized pre-capitalistic societies. C. The rationality that capitalist society had introduced in privately owned plants, and the values of universality, equality, and freedom, which are closely bound to this rationality. Excuse me. For all these reasons, the socialist revolution was expected in the minds of Marx, Engels, and the Marxist thinkers that followed them to mark the end of, quote, prehistory, and the transition from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom. This scheme of things, worked out in the 19th century, continues to dominate most socialist thought in our own age. However, since 1917, the existence first of a single state, then of several others, all endowed with a socialist character, which they boast of at the ideological level, though at the political and social level they actually function within the framework of a very complex reality, has brought out clearly a more or less striking discordance between, on the one hand, the social, economic, and political reality of these societies or states, and, on the other hand, the above-mentioned ideological superstructure. Resolving such a discordance should, moreover, be one of the primary tasks of a living socialist philosophy, which seeks to operate in those areas of thought where the understanding of reality and the demystification of all ideologies are most advanced. The discordance between reality and ideology is in itself neither new nor surprising. Great social and political movements have nearly always developed somewhat simplified conceptions of the future and of the possibilities of achieving the values which inspired them. Nearly always, once victory has been achieved and the social reality discovered to be more tangled and complex, Nearly always, once victory has been achieved and the social reality discovered to be more tangled and complex than had been foreseen, leaders have come forward to take advantage of the situation and to claim that the situation corresponds exactly to what the revolutionaries had wished and foreseen. But progressive thinkers have always tried to point out the distance that separated such affirmations from reality, to dismantle the machinery that has made it possible for a revolutionary ideology to become an apologetic ideology, and to reestablish the harmony between thought and reality that alone can endow the former, thought, with a truly progressive character. Among others, such is the function that Marx and Engels performed in their relationship to the ideologists of the triumphant middle class. And such is certainly the function that all thinkers who wish to keep the legacy of the great founders of Marxism effective and alive should now fulfill in their relationship to A, the apologists of the new socialist states, which were born of anti-capitalist revolutions; B, the apologists of the Western capitalist societies which are undergoing an evolution; and C, the apologists of the societies of the, quote, third world. This is why we now face an urgent task, that of liberating ourselves from all the slogans that clutter the political life and the thought and theory of the socialist movement, so as to be able to return to the kind of analysis of the world's social and political evolution since 1917 that would be both positive and accurate. Within the framework of this task, I would like to raise here, if only in a somewhat schematic manner, a problem which seems to me of particular importance. If we compare the analyses that Marx has left us with the real evolution of both capitalist and socialist societies since, respectively, the end of the 19th century and 1917 until today, we find that such a comparison calls for two very important corrections, which, though they may appear at the level of theory to be the kind that could easily be integrated within the general body of Marxist philosophy, would in practice require considerable changes in the aims and perspectives of socialist action. Each of these two corrections concerns the problem of relationships between social reality and humanist values. In the Western capitalist societies, as well as in those societies that have a socialist character. Let us therefore begin by referring back to the first of the two major analyses of capitalist societies that Marx has left us. A theory of the fetishism of goods, or to use a terminological correction later introduced by Lukács, of goods reification. And B, the theory of the progressive pauperization of the proletariat and its necessary evolution toward an awareness of its own revolutionary role. The first of these two theories has proved to be not only valid, but also much more important in an understanding of the evolution of the capitalist world in the 20th century than Marxist theorists before 1917 would have expected. The second, however, has been rendered obsolete, and indeed has even been contradicted by the real evolution of a society whose essential structural aspects have been modified. In spite of his orthodoxy, Lenin was quite characteristically obliged, in order to take into account the social and political reality of his age, to add two very important notions to Marx's analysis. A, that the spontaneous evolution of the proletariat leads to the creation of not a revolutionary class, but of labor unions, and B, that there exists throughout the West a category of the proletariat which varies in its numerical importance, but constitutes a, quote, working class aristocracy, which is integrated in capitalist society and provides the social foundations for the reformist movement. To these observations of Lenin, which must be elucidated and developed before we can understand the evolution that has occurred in the first half of the 20th century, some remarks must be added on the changes Western capitalism has undergone since the end of World War II. There is no room here to develop these ideas at greater length, so I must limit myself to observing that as the revolution which orthodox Marxists have expected, and thanks to the experience gained in the economic slump of 1929 to 33, and to the pressure of the expansion of the economic and consequently the military power of the USSR and the whole socialist bloc, the capitalist world has now developed more or less satisfactory devices for economic self-regulation, which allow it to avoid, to a great extent, structural crises of overproduction. There has resulted in the industrialized nations of the West not only a great expansion of productive forces, but also a constantly rising standard of living for the great majority of the population, including the working class. It may, of course, be possible for a socialist economy to expand production and increase the well-being of the population even faster, but this has not yet been proved unequivocally. And, in any case, socialist action in the industrial societies of the West can no longer be founded on the premise of the increasing pauperization of the proletariat and the proletariat's necessary transformation into a revolutionary force. In these circumstances, such societies are now beginning to follow a social, economic, and political evolution different from the evolution predicted by Marx, with other perspectives and other dangers. In these societies, the workers are no longer necessarily driven by increasing pauperization to choose the path of socialism. A true socialist world might, and indeed probably would, offer them certain economic advantages and increased well-being. However, they cannot be expected to acquire an awareness of this as inevitably as the Marxist theorists of the 19th century believed. The struggle between capitalism and socialism in these societies thus becomes a struggle for domination over the class consciousness of the workers and the population as a whole. It is particularly important, moreover, that the infrastructure, far from being of assistance to the forces of socialism in this struggle, as Marx and the traditional Marxists believed, operates on the contrary in favor of integration in the existing social order. Since the economic changes just mentioned have determined a very profound social and psychological evolution. However, at a certain level, the evolution of Western capitalist society has confirmed Marx's analysis to a far greater extent than envisaged by the 19th century Marxist thinkers, i.e. in terms of Marx's theories of the fetishism of goods. Marx demonstrated to what extent the appearance of the market reduces all trans-individual values to something merely implicit, by eliminating them from awareness and reducing them progressively to the phenomenological and quantitative aspects of two new properties of inert objects, value and price, which transform goods into wares. Marx, and especially Lukács after him, have insisted strongly on the passive character that this development of reification imposes on life, and on the behavior of individuals subjected to those economic laws of a market that acquire the characteristics of a quasi-natural power. On the other hand, the development of production for the market has now created, for the first time in history, the foundations for the insertion of new values within social life and for their subsequent development, values including those of equality, freedom, and tolerance, which contribute greatly to the constitution of Western humanism. Later, however, the shift from a craft society producing for the market to an industrial capitalist society, which involves so many economic inequalities and the organization of production on a hierarchical basis within the plant, weakened values of humanistic individualism in both their application and their intrinsic nature. In the values of humanistic individualism's application, they have been eliminated from production and limited to the realm of the actual market and the abstract and peripheral fields of law and politics. In their nature, the values of humanistic individualism have purely formal character, which has replaced the real content which they once possessed. However difficult it may be to contest the validity of these analyses, one must nevertheless admit today that neither Marx nor Lukács was able to see, in the societies they were analyzing, to what extent an area of individual activity and values that could still supply a structure for individual awareness was maintained as a result of the mere existence of the liberal market, and later of a monopolistic market subject to very limited state intervention. The development of monopolist imperialism, especially after the Second World War, and the massive interventions of the state were closely related to the appearance of self-regulating devices that in actuality eliminated every function of responsibility of the individual in production and in the market, thereby emptying the individual's awareness of all its autonomous or immanent content, and achieving a degree of passivity which even the most pessimistic theorist of the early years of our century would have imagined only with great difficulty. Of course, this increasing passivity of the population creates a very dangerous situation for culture, especially humanistic culture. The increasing passivity of the population reveals itself in a constant weakening of interest in anything that lies beyond the scope of the consumer needs of the individual or his family unit. At the same time, his standard of living progressively improves, all of which contributes substantially to the integration of the workers within the existing society and counters their evolution towards socialism. In such a situation, the socialist must formulate a program directed toward acquiring the power to influence the awareness of individuals at the level of superstructures and in their political, social, and cultural thinking. There are two possible alternatives which the workers in the contemporary Western world must choose between consciously or implicitly. They must choose a technocratic society which bestows the powers of decision on a very restricted minority of technocrats who are capable of ensuring a constantly rising standard of living for a great majority of the population, but who will at the same time lead them, if not necessarily, at least probably, into a dehumanized world in which cultural possibilities are reduced to a bare minimum. Or they must choose a socialist democratic society which is likewise capable of ensuring an equal and perhaps even high degree of well-being, and which would also and above all ensure the development of a sense of individual responsibility within the total population, so as to create the social and economic foundations for a development of its spiritual and cultural life. The whole problem can be reduced to the problem of making wage earners understand that the path of convenience and selfishness may well lead toward integration, but that their interest and those of their families could inspire them to swim against this stream in order to save both their own dignity and the great cultural values inherited from the past. In conclusion, I can mention only briefly the very important change that such a novel situation implies at the level of political aims and perspectives. It appears obvious that the suppression of absolute pauperization, the creation of devices for economic self-regulation, and the progressive indifference, passivity, and integration of the population as a whole have all contributed towards depriving the traditional program of a socialist or proletarian revolution of its practical value and its political chances of success. This is why, in the capitalist societies of the Western world, the only realistic socialist program today is one of structural reforms that would analyze the situation clearly and without hesitation or scruple in such a way as to make the workers understand that it is entirely in their interest to demand first the right to control and later to manage their plants. These rights alone would assure them, in addition to economic advantages which may vary in importance, an effective participation and responsibility in the major decisions of economic, social, and political life, and an opportunity to play an active part in the development of a truly humanist culture. We thus reach the concept of a path leading to socialism, and analogous to that followed by the middle class in feudal society. Along such a path, economic transformations, though born of conflict, would be gradual and peaceful, and would precede a potential political revolution, which is no longer inevitable in all cases, as the rise to power of the middle class in the 1800s Germany demonstrates. Section 2. If we now proceed to the other side of our analysis, we are obliged to observe that the evolution of societies with a socialist character have also proved to be extremely complex and, above all, different from what had been foreseen or predicted in a necessarily schematic and summary manner by the creators of Marxism. The difference between these predictions and reality are numerous, but this should not be at all surprising, since no theorist, however great, can arrive at anything but a very summary and general scheme of reality without the aid of empirical, concrete experience. However, this poses no major problem so long as such a scheme of reality, however general, corresponds to the essential structure of reality. As stated earlier, the philosophy of Marx, Engels, and the Marxists who followed them predicted a socialist and above all communist society of the future, which, thanks to the socialization of the means of production and the setting up of planned production, would bring together the positive qualities of the three great forms of social organization that are characteristic of what Marxists have sometimes called, quote, the prehistory of humanity. That is to say, A, the suppression of social classes and of man's exploitation by man, which humanity had already known in primitive societies, though at a level of extreme poverty. B, the qualitative and not yet reified character of interhuman relations between man and nature, which had characterized in a barbaric and unjust manner pre-capitalist and essentially traditional forms of the organization of production and distribution. C, the two great contributions of production for the market, and especially of capitalist production, such as 1, the rational organization of production and the rapid development of productivity that it brings about and ensures. Capitalist society had introduced this rationalization in its own plants, but not in relationships between them or in production as a whole, whereas the socialist society of the future was destined to extend the application of rationalization to the whole field of the production of goods, and 2, the humanist values, born and developed in Western society, parallel to the appearance and development of production for the market, especially the values of universality, equality, individual freedom, and, as part of the latter, freedom of expression. It is obvious that a society founded on true community and real freedom would then be achieved for the first time in history as a result of the simultaneous application of the following principles: the abolition of exploitation, the suppression of class distinctions, the establishment of qualitative relationships between men and nature, the rational organization of production, and together with a great expansion of productivity, the establishment of real universality, equality, and freedom. Socialist society was expected to restore and further develop the values of Western humanism, since it would not only strip the values of Western humanism of the merely formal character by suppressing all exploitation and class distinctions, but also bind them organically to a community both truly human and fully conscious of those trans-individual values, which would be liberated at last from the heavy handicaps that poverty and exploitation had imposed in the pre-capitalist periods of history. In concluding this study, I might mention the importance in theory and in doctrine of the Yugoslav experiment, even though it happens to have been undertaken in a relatively small country. Seeking to react against bureaucratic or Stalinistic centralization, Yugoslavia has integrated to socialist thought the discovery that the socialization of the means of production does not necessarily imply, as Marx and later Marxists have thought, integral central planning and the suppression of the market. The greatest achievement of Yugoslav socialist democracy, self-management by the workers, is a means of ensuring an effective democracy. It also ensures a considerable socialization of the ownership of the means of production, making it possible to suppress both the exploitation of man by man and, in any case, a considerable part of the manifestations of reification. At the same time, it ensures the maintenance of production for the market, which can constitute the basis for a real and authentic development of freedom, especially that of expression. Self-management by the workers seems to me to be the only possible foundation for a truly socialist program in the contemporary world. The character of this self-management and the road taken to reach self-management will of course depend on whether one starts from a capitalist society with a formal democracy, from a dictatorial system like that of Spain, from a socialist society with centralized planning. The character of this self-management and the road taken to reach this self-management will, of course, depend on whether one starts from a capitalist society with a formal democracy, from a dictatorial system like that of Spain, from a socialist society with centralized planning, or from the society of a developing country. And it must be kept in mind that the maintenance of the market, even if accompanied by the suppression of private ownership of the means of production, may cause important difficulties which can be solved only after serious empirical and theoretical studies have been made. Translated by Eduard Ruditi.